Hello and welcome to the Minus One podcast, where we ask the most interesting people in the world about times in their lives where they've had to answer a question we all eventually struggle with. What's next? Because before you launch at zero, you have to decide what to work on at minus one. I'm your host, Aditya Agarwal, partner at South Park Commons. And I'm joined here today by Mike Krieger. When it comes to shaping our lives with products that we use every day, Mike has had quite a bit of experience. Alongside Kevin Systrom, he founded Instagram in 2010, grew the business through its acquisition by Facebook, and then, crazily enough, started another company, Artifact, in 2021. And after recently wrapping up with his journey at Artifact, he joined Anthropic a few months ago as the chief product officer. So he has a front row seat to everything that's happening in the Gen AI world. Welcome, Mikey. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the podcast.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Amazing. So, Mike, you know that we love digging into the parts of people's lives that are essentially seminal in them making their choices about what to work next, right? So I think we have to kind of start with you from, the very beginning. Tell us a little bit about, you grew up in Brazil, right? So tell us a little bit about like your early days coming to Stanford and so on.
Sure thing. So I'm from Brazil, from São Paulo. My parents are still there. And was interested in computers from a pretty early age. My dad got like a old IBM computer. I guess it's old now. At the time it was new. And I remember there was this game where you were there were two gorillas on the screen and you would throw bananas at each other like bombs. It was like the original Angry Birds. And in my head, the graphics were much better. I looked up this game recently and it's very, basic, no pun intended. But what I remember is at some point I figured out that you could type edit and it was just it was written in QBasic or something. You could see the source code. I had no idea what that meant, but I was like, oh, that's what makes this thing happen. So it was early seed that maybe building something was going to be interesting to me. And then in high school, I got super into web development. I think that was very early for Brazil. The web was happening, but all these things like Dreamweaver, all these different ways you could actually see the source of web pages and edit them. And I was trying to point my way, this is really fun. But I don't know what your experience was like, but I had no role models in my life saying, oh yeah, you can go build companies or build software. So I was like, oh, I guess this is a cool thing I do on the weekends.
What is the first web page you built? Do you remember?
I actually do remember. There's two of them, and one is embarrassing and one was homework. So I was really, really into Weezer band. Okay. So I had a whole Weezer fan site, Weezer tabs, tabbed out the songs, news about Weezer. I was in a Weezer web ring. Do you remember web ring? So it was the whole thing. So my screen name was Mike Weezer because I was so into them. So I was expressing my music stuff through there. And the other thing I built was I was doing a Brazilian history project in school, and nobody remembers this technology anymore. But at some point, you could do this thing called image maps. So you could take an image and basically define polygons around which, if you clicked on it, would perform some action. Presumably browsers still support this because browsers still support everything, but I've not seen one in use in a long time. But I built this whole thing. It was an image map of Brazil, and you could click on each state and have a history. So, early explorations in UI.
It's listen, you had Web 2 back before there was Web 2,
Totally.
But, before we kind of get into that, isn't it interesting that all of us, when we have a tool that allows us to create things, the first thing we want to do is tell the world about who we are and kind of our passions. Because my first website was geocities.com/metro/Paris/4096. And what I put on there was my favorite music, kind of my favorite bands, my favorite movies. And it's so fundamental to express ourselves in that way. And I think today we take it for granted, but that is literally the first instinct that you have. And it's just I can put myself out on the internet.
And here I am. Yeah. And join the neighborhood. I was on a tripod too, which had neighborhoods, and you could join it was in the music neighborhood as well. Yeah. No, for sure. I think there's that desire to express and then the desire to connect. And at that time it looked you could put some probably pretty sketchy HTML code and it would create a forum on your, at least a comment section on your website, along with your visit counter, very important as well. So yeah, CGI,
that's super important. Yeah,
Yeah.
CGI.
A lot of old technology on this podcast so far. But yeah, then I decided to come to school in the States, and that was primarily driven by not really knowing exactly what I wanted to do when I was 18. In Brazil, you declare your degree as you apply, and then you're locked in. So if you change your mind, you're starting all over. I wasn't sure yet. I thought I was going to be a journalist, but I had this like programming stuff that I liked. I was still into music. I was like, I can't decide right now. And so coming to the States gives you that sort of buffer to figure it out over a little bit
Sure.
longer time.
So you go to Stanford. What did you study?
I studied symbolic systems, which I used to think as this weird, like unknown degree, but I think there's enough of us now that have like done something. Like Marissa Meyer was symbolic systems, Rick Reed Hoffman was symbolic systems. There's like a small but mighty crew that did this degree, and this is maybe actually very relevant to the topic of this podcast, which is I'm bad at picking one thing, and I was still interested in writing, and I was also interested in neuroscience, and I was interested in computer science. I was really interested in like software and making software usable. And symbolic systems is interdisciplinary. Let me see if I'm going to get it right. Computer science, philosophy, artificial intelligence, cognitive science, linguistics. Oh man, I almost had it. There's 6. I don't know what the last one is, but basically a bit of everything with one concentration. I loved it because it meant that like through my 4 years there, actually I stayed on for a 5th, just to do another master's. And it was like, I can take so much breath here. And that was a lot. That really spoke to me.
I think that the SimSys kind of folks that I've met over the years that I've worked with, for instance, Chris Cox, I think was also SimSys at
Chris
Facebook.
was SimSys, yeah.
And I found them to be the most interesting combination of both creative and actually incredibly technical. And it's very rare to find those two in concert. And I think you're totally right that when it comes to -1 and kind of figuring out the different things that you can do, that creativity and generativity, I think, makes a huge difference because you have this confidence that like, yeah, I can come up with interesting new ideas and I'm not going to get boxed in.
And you can both, I think the 3 questions that are very basic is like, can you build it? And he's like, what are you building? How are you building it? And why are you building it? And I think if I had done pure CS, I would have gotten very good at good at the how, but less good at the what and the why.
Right.
But I had a great thesis advisor, and he basically sat me down and he was like, SimSys is great. He was in the CS department. He's like, but I worry that you'll graduate without having the ability to actually go and build. And that's really important. So he very correctly, if there was a choice between like hard CS class and like a less hard CS class, he would always push me to take the harder one because
That's awesome.
I think, realized that like to have, people, if they're talking about T-shaped people, like you got to build that verticality as well.
Yeah. So you come from Brazil, you go to Stanford, you study SimSys, awesome program. Take us through a little bit from kind of like, getting your degree up until kind of maybe the -1 stages that led to Instagram.
Yeah. So one interesting thing is being an immigrant, then there's some constraints you have around like building and how entrepreneurial you're going to get. So, I had friends in college who were like, oh, I'm going to leave and start a company. I'm like, I need to like extend my F1 OPT to be able to get a job and then eventually get an H1, like that whole dance. But so I had a back of the napkin sketch, and it was, when I graduated, I wanted to get a job somewhere that would sponsor my visa. That was like a 40-ish person company. And then I wanted to be on like a founding-ish team, like first 8 people. And then I wanted to start a company. That was my like 10-year vision. My 40-ish group, or company was Meebo, which was this like online chat startup, which had fantastic technology. Like they were doing things in asynchronous networking and, like crazy desktop like UIs in the browser, pretty ahead of the curve around where everybody else was, except maybe Google at the time. So I learned a ton. And I also got to see like founders, do the real work of running the company, which is not just like, oh, it's fun to found it. It's like, we're managing your board, we're managing fundraising, we're bringing the company along, we're figuring out when to pivot, all of that. I was like, oh, that looks really, really cool.
Elaine and Seth and all of those guys were incredible. It was actually an amazing company, way ahead of its time, and really strong talent.
And it was great. I mean, I thought also the founding trio was like, they each brought something different. I worked closely with Elaine, who was like doing product work, UX. Sandy was doing all things backend. Seth was doing all things business and making the company run. And that was also kind of an early seed of like how I ended up partnering with Kevin, which was we have complementary interests, but distinct like areas of like deep focus. And I think that worked well. But I even at Meebo, I spent all my weekends like prototyping stuff that, sometimes I would ship, but sometimes not. So I was very interested in the iPhone and the iPhone, like beginning of the App Store. So I built a augmented reality crime tracker. So you would like stand outside and like, it was a terrifying app. Actually, you would like swing your camera around and it was like, it was arson 30 feet away. And it was, yeah, it was building off of like the San Francisco open city data stuff. I built a Polaroid app. You can see like the early Instagram seeds in there as well, where you'd send photos and it would shake it and it would reveal the camera or reveal the photo. I just love building. I was in there and I was like, I want to keep going. And I think this will connect to some themes that we'll talk about today, but you don't know that weekend, that side project you did is going to connect to something later, but it can, and often it will. And so, and just being out there building like creates that, opportunistic, moment. So for me, it was at Coffee Bar, which now is Ernest, which is a great fancy restaurant in San Francisco, but at the time was like a good coffee shop. So, we were working out, Coffee Bar. It's now Ernest, this like fancy, San Francisco restaurant. And I was just there every weekend and I started seeing Kevin like show up, and I knew him a little bit from school, and he was doing kind of a -1 situation where he was working at a startup, but prototyping this thing called Bourbon, which was a location check-in plus photos plus games plus leaderboard. And there was a lot in there because it was HTML5 was very easy to build on top and iterate. And we just got to talking. It was like a classic meet cute, like, oh, what are you working on? Oh, you're working on side projects too. Oh, cool. You're doing a company. What text editor do you use? I use TextMate. Oh, I'm using like Sublime, and we got to talking over that. And, I really liked the problem space he was working on, the product. And then pretty soon afterwards, he decided to go fundraise, and, he was like, do you want to be my co-founder? Like, I talked to investors. They want like a technical co-founder to come in. And then it was just from then to actually getting to start Instagram was all visa stuff. It was like proving to the government that this company with only one person and 500K in seed funding was a real company. They asked us for our business plan, which is very funny because we didn't have a business plan before. We raised an angel round off of a prototype and a demo. So, all that navigation process, but it was very clear to me from like early on in meeting Kevin that, it wasn't worth doing this middle step of going to work somewhere small, but not be a founder, that I wanted to be in there. I wanted to be, fully, immersed as a founder. And that's what we did.
It's to maybe elaborate on something that you said that we feel very strongly about at SPC as a guiding principle is that it's very hard to do -1 unless you're actually just producing something. Now, my kind of tool of the trade is like, I like, writing code, but either, you're like pushing pixels, you're writing code. Maybe nowadays you're doing like a Figma prototype. But I think it's really important in that stage to have a canvas to express yourself, right? And ideally that canvas shouldn't just be like PowerPoint. I mean, it can be, but ideally something that allows you more expressiveness. And so I'm curious, like, would you agree with that? That like, it's just really important to just start creating something?
Absolutely. I think if you are not creating things, you have all hypotheses and no actual contact with, what's even doable from a building perspective, what's even possible from getting other people to use the thing, if it's anything social, anything that requires adoption. Like, they're all unvalidated ideas. Not that you need to validate because you instantly need to know that it's a business, but I think you need to validate in order to decide whether there's energy that you want to keep pouring into something and touching that. And I think you're right. I think that could be, an open source thing that you've put out and you're just getting your first, reactions to that. But for me, it's always been very important that whatever I work on or whatever I build has that actual contact with the world. And it doesn't have to be necessarily, not everything needs to be a huge reach thing, but you want to get that validation of something mattered that you built.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really interesting. In my mind, I almost visualize it that there's some, three-dimensional terrain of essentially things you want to figure out. And by each of the different kinds of almost like traversal or analysis, you can kind of figure out like, okay, what does the shape of the business look like? By building products, you can get a sense of what actually feels good. And in that same way, I often tell people that just by writing some code, you start getting intuition for where are the actual opportunities that code can accelerate, right? Like, and I'm curious if you guys felt that way, but I remember in the early days of Instagram, your app was also fast, right? It like felt snappy in a way that like other mobile apps didn't. And it just made a huge difference. And I bet that's because you had actually figured out like that was possible through like building.
Absolutely. And also this is one place where, you could do hypothetical performance work or you could build for like a real use case. And for me, it was, I had the iPhone 4, which at the time was like pretty, I think that's
Good device.
still near peak industrial design for the iPhone line. I'm glad that like basically the new iPhones just look like that one. But Kevin had the 3GS, which was like that, it had its charm, but his was like extremely slow for some reason. Sometimes iPhones go south. I don't know if it's the battery or something. And it was great because we did all our performance work for that device. And so, if it worked fast enough on that one, it was going to be great on the other side. But again, I think of things like, performance. I think of things like networking. So living in San Francisco in 2009, AT&T was basically your only choice. And it was quite bad.
Don't
The
remind me
Flores
of
Park
those
on the
days.
weekends. There's nothing. You couldn't get anything. And so all the things we did around network performance, error recovery, if you were in a beautiful room with great, Wi-Fi, you wouldn't have seen that. But we were out there every day testing the thing and then like iterating really, really quickly.
So that's such an amazing story. And by the way, I remember when iPhones did not work in Hayes Valley because Hayes
Yeah.
Valley basically did not have any AT&T repeaters, and it was insane. Like that was basically a full dead zone in the city.
Yeah.
But yeah, but Mike, maybe coming back to this, I think just to almost in some ways give people the confidence, it sounds like both you and Kevin independently threw away a bunch of things before you kind of settled on Instagram. So like obviously Kevin had Bourbon and a bunch of things, and you had been hacking on some side projects. And just tell us a little bit like, did you feel a sense of loss? Did you feel a sense of regret? Or was it just like actually like the easiest time to throw away an idea is like in the beginning? Because it's way harder the further along you get.
Yeah. And actually we should talk about Bourbon at some point because that's like an example of like -1 to, negative zero point 0.5 where like, you're like, is this zero? Like, do we go here or do we wait? But yeah, I realized that there are projects that I was doing where the goal was traction and it didn't make sense without traction, and ones that were more, I think Robin Sloan talks about apps as a home cooked meal. Sometimes you just want to cook and you're not opening a restaurant. You're just like, I want to express some idea through this thing and then be like, great, that was an idea. Got it out there. People enjoyed it. It doesn't need to be in the top 10 of the App Store. In fact, if it got there, it would be tremendously distracting, in some way, or it would like lock me in or box me in, to something like that. I saw this guy who made a website where all you did was like turn on checkboxes. Did you see this thing? It was like very viral for like a hot minute last week. Yeah. And he basically had a very fun, like 2-week experience of trying to scale concurrent checking of checkboxes on a website with 1 million checkboxes. And then after 2 weeks, he's like, I'm shutting it down. That was great. I learned a lot. It was fun. We're done. That thing did not need to be a venture backed or anything backed business. But yeah, it's funny that you asked the like loss question because I'll occasionally go, on my GitHub and scroll back far enough. And I've open sourced a lot of those, or I don't know if they're still around, but you'll go and you're like, oh, that thing. I built this like cool visualization of like, how did like at the time Twitter was growing a lot. So I built a way of like, doing a really nice presentation of tweets on large screens because people were wanting to use it for conferences. And like that had its moment. And then this moment had passed, but I learned a bunch about, networking and making sure that we were doing good display and all of that. And the Twitter API, which was important at the time. And similar to Kevin, I think he tried a bunch of things and that was the one that he was more invested to continue.
Yeah, it's funny. I actually, my story maybe a couple of years ago in a similar vein, this is so dumb, but I just got very annoyed at the Chrome bookmarks manager because I'm just like, I want to manage my bookmarks better. So you kind of spend like 2 weekends in a row just kind of hacking on the extensions API. You build a new bookmarks kind of like, experience. And then at the end of it, you're like, this is done for me. Like I made something a little better. I learned a bunch. And now like I kind of got that like feeling out of my system and I no longer need to hold on to it. Yeah, absolutely. It's a really
This is going to be an interesting topic that we can cover later as well, which is, I think with a lot of AI tooling now, you can kind of get to something feeling real faster, which on one hand, I think will let you validate those things much faster and like just feel like you did something of, some substance as well.
Right.
And I think that is almost entirely good. I do wonder in the same way that like people feel, I think psychologically more affection for furniture that they've assembled from IKEA and stuff that you bought. Like there is a grind where you're like, and then my Python packages were conflicting. And then like I went, like yak shaving, like I did my 2 hours of that. And it's like, I don't know, there's maybe I'm nostalgic for like bad developer experiences too.
I think that like that recursive nature of finding the the hard part of like the problem. Even at least with the AI stuff today, it still exists. Like, you'll probably just have to figure out like where that long pole is, because I bet all of the folks who are kind of, used to writing, I don't know, call it like, straight, raw dogging the sea, like, if you will. Like, they're kind of looking at us JavaScript, Python folks and kind of being like, these kids have it so easy. So I think it just keeps
Totally,
on applying.
exactly,
Yeah. So we get to
totally.
look down on the folks who are writing using all the AI code, but I totally agree with you about that dichotomy. Okay, so not holding on to kind of stuff you have built, and I really could you elaborate on that Bourbon part of it, kind of like almost stopping it at negative 0.5, because this is again one of our philosophies at SPC is that like don't like throw away the good ideas in pursuit of the great ones, and those are the
Yeah.
toughest decisions because you see the good ones, you get excited by it, and then you really have to be like, but is it great? And so like how did you guys make that decision? That doesn't sound easy.
Yeah, we started, joined up, started working on things, and about 3 months in, we had like Bourbon on the HTML5 thing, and we were distributing it, in private beta, but trying to spread it. And it was hard to explain what we were doing because it had become like too many ands. This is like now, I'm doing less investing than I was like kind of right post Instagram. I realized like whenever a company has like a lot of conjunctions in their pitch, like it's probably not the right direction. And it was like, well, we're checking app and there's like photos you can attach. You can actually attach videos too. And there's a game attached. There's like this way that we do invites and you can make plans. And you're like, it's like, it's a lot. And I'm going to miscredit this because I don't remember what it was. I looked for this tweet and I couldn't find it. It was like something like, it's the difference between watching an episodic show that gets released one episode at a time and then like the Netflix like drop of everything. And there is some value to like developing the story of your product over time. And I think we just ended up in the place where we were trying to make up in volume what we lacked in like actual like core product market fit in terms of the core product. But it was, we had 1,000+ people using it, which at the time felt like a lot. And there were
Pretty
those
good.
people in
Yeah.
Hawaii and people locally and people like talked about it, said like they loved the product. We built an iPhone, like a native app. We shipped that. People liked it, but it was that thing where like it was hard to see the path to it becoming really huge. And there's something really powerful about the urgency you have when you're like a first time entrepreneur. The time 500,000 seemed like a lot, but you're like, eventually this is going to run out. I'm like, my visa is going to like expire. Like we need to make this work. And is this the avenue that's actually going to make this work? And it took actually seeing that like that moment where your investor writes you off because they realize that like you're stuck on this idea and you're not like gonna pivot. And you're like, but if they're seeing that and they see a lot of people, like, how can we turn the mirror on ourselves and see how we've gotten stuck at the like, it's almost going to be the launching point for something great, but it's like not quite right. And that was the moment where like, okay, we need to take a step back and realize whether this is really the thing that we are going to like triple down on and continue to build on top, or have we just stacked a bunch of somewhat related stuff and it's actually time to, pull one piece out and see if that's its own standalone thing.
That takes courage. I mean, I don't think that's easy. I think people are, even today, I see it is so hard to kind of like essentially give up on an idea that has that middle amount of traction. It's almost like that is the fate you don't wish on a founder, because it's much better to actually get zero traction. Then you have like clear, easy signal, right? Like, yeah, go and move on to the next thing. Is when you have a little bit
Absolutely.
of traction that when you get into trouble.
Especially if you built the
Okay.
feedback
Yeah.
loops where that traction is like accruing, like, my friends like it, or, I've
Yeah.
like met people through it and, people are using it. Like, I think that's the hardest thing is like getting people like
Yeah.
it retains and you're like, the things I used to believe about product that I no longer believe is that like, good retention is indicative of a thing that will do well in the long run. It's like you can have very well retaining low growth products is the, maybe unintuitive result that I've found now.
I mean, that is so true, which is that kind of the historical wisdom is like if you have like what, like 40%, retention after weeks, call it month to end of month two, you're kind of like in the top 1%. But that
Yeah,
doesn't mean you have high growth, like you
exactly.
need both. Yeah.
100%.
Okay. So you guys, wow, that's amazing. I actually didn't know that you stopped Bourbon at like that point. So you start taking out parts that you think might be the thing. And so how long did it take you from maybe stopping that to actually, starting kind of building V0 of Instagram?
Very quickly because we were like, look, this product is pretty good, but it's HTML5 mostly. Like, it's only a few people using the iPhone app.
Yeah.
And the photos part works, even though it's really hard. And I think that's an interesting, like, if people are finding a way to use your product for something that it is like built for, but not built that well for, like, there's something there. There's like a desire there. So we pulled out, I'm like, let's make the whole experience around that. The clock is ticking. We're not paying I was paying myself the H-1B minimum, whatever that was, what's it called?
I've been paid that. I've been paid that myself. So
the prevailing wage, whatever that is. You're
exactly.
No tech company would hire you for that. But, and I was going through it and we're like, okay, we got to get something quick. And we ran really quickly. And I think we had a lot of conviction, not necessarily around this being the perfect idea. And in fact, we didn't unship Bourbon and we were ready to turn off Instagram if it didn't work and go back to trying something else on Bourbon. But at least conviction that we needed to move on something. There's a phrase we had learned at Stanford in the same class we took a couple of years apart, which was CEO saying, we may not be right, but at least we're not confused. And I think that is a really guiding principle, I think, for exploration. It's like, you're not sure if you're right. You won't know actually maybe potentially for years, but don't confuse yourself by hedging and being like, well, we're going to build a thing that's a little bit of this, a little bit of that, or we're going to keep 2 prototypes going. It's like, I'm become a really strong believer in pick a direction, have a clear-eyed view about what problem you're solving, go, and then poke your head up a little bit and be like, was that the right decision? Okay, let's reevaluate there. But I've also seen founders be in hedging land where they're working on 2 or even 3 things at once. And I've never seen that be the path to success.
Yeah, I mean, on that point itself, I think that hedging pattern ends up repeating itself in many different ways. It's not just in products. I think people end up doing it with their careers. People often end up doing it with big life decisions. And I tell people that it's okay to reevaluate, but you cannot be reevaluating concurrently, right? You can reevaluate every 6 months, 12 months, give yourself some time. But it's just so bad for your psychology if you're kind of reevaluating and living multiple versions of your life at the same time. That sounds super hard and not fun for anyone.
I've come to believe it's really true for executive hires. This is much further down the line. When we were growing our team, I got this advice I think was spot on, which is you have conviction in your hire, pretend that they are the perfect person for the role for some period of time, 3 months. Tell everybody on the team how great they are, invest in them, go for it. And then have a check-in point, which is was that true? But at least it was definitely, if it doesn't work out, it wasn't because you didn't believe and invest in them. Right. So I think I've actually never connected that to other pieces of life, but I think it's totally right. If you're not doing that on product, you'll always have that feeling of I'll keep this one around too, and let's invest in it too, or I'll spend a week, a month in New York, but I won't move there yet.
Yeah. It's about that executive thing for 1 second. It is literally every single executive that I have had the chance of working with who got hired into a company. Everybody goes through that initial euphoria, and then everybody goes through the trough of despair because you're hey, this person isn't perfect, and why do they have so much to learn? Why haven't they fixed all my problems yet? And I'm just guys, it takes a while, right? Especially if you're, a strong founder. So, could not agree more. Okay, so you guys build Instagram. I think your initial success is well documented, so I won't ask you too much about that. But let me ask, what do you think that from a technical perspective that you did that you kind of look back on? I'm just really proud of that. And I think that played a big difference in the first, call it 3 to 6 months.
I think performance for sure was one of those areas where we continued to invest in it post that optimizing for the iPhone. I used to call it the diseased iPhone 3GS. That piece was huge.
Was that the one with the gray bevel at the bottom?
It was the rounded black one. It was the one that looked almost a turtle shell one. That's the The gray bevel one was that was a good one actually. I like that one too. The iPhone industrial design is so good. We continued to invest in it. We had we were renting a very small office, and we would do this exercise where we would take all of our endpoints and measure their, average latency. And then we'd make a goal to by the end of the week, cut all of that in half. Cause it's early. There's always stuff to cut. They're always doing something dumb. And
100%.
I believe that stuff accrues where people open the app and it feels snappy. It's an app they want to open up. If they have a minute before, I was going to say their Uber arrives. There was no Uber back then, their minibus arrives. They have something to do that's not going to take a whole minute to do it. I used to say don't make people wait while they're waiting. They're just trying to solve something a boredom thing quickly. The other piece I think really, really mattered was figuring out what the like next adjacent product thing was and making sure that building that was easy. So we invested in some things around dev velocity, I guess is what you would call it. Now at the time, we just called it like trying to build good code. That if you were maybe starting a company and you're trying to move really quickly, you wouldn't have done. So we had great unit tests, which like pretty rare, I think, for like a company. Yeah. That was just me and Kevin. We had our Django, we were using Django as a web framework. We had factored it in a way where like all the different pieces were like pretty decoupled. We used their like signal system, all this like stuff that like, it was like a definitely like go fast at the beginning by going slow, or like, optimize your workbench, like sharpen your tools before going in. To an extent, I've seen companies fall into the prey of like, we've wrote our own programming language, and you're like, it's 2 years in and you haven't shipped anything. But like we found that balance of like high quality, nimble iteration speed. I think we did this well at Artifact too, where I've talked to multiple people that were at Artifact that are now at other companies. They're like, man, I really miss our dev environment. Like it was a very, like iteration felt really, really, really good there. So I think those two were really main things we did. And the third one is like actually really caring and looking at like what was on the network. Like, and this came up later when we started exploring machine learning. Very easy to get caught in stats and say like photo uploads went up by 10% this week, or our new ML algorithm on Instagram Explorer, like increased time spent by 5%. But like how and like what's actually happening under the hood. So I think we had a really good pulse, and we built internal dashboards around just like keeping pulse on like what the health of the network was at a like far more qualitative level. And I think that's easy to get lost as you scale. So you have to build tools to keep an eye on that in a more scalable way. But those are some of the things I think we did well early.
Yeah, the second point really resonates. I think that's something that, especially with consumer products, keeps on coming up over and over again, is that you can, I believe you should not be data driven, but you should really be data informed, right? Like the data should be in some ways like informing your qualitative sense of what's going on, and not the other way around. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead to maybe when you guys first landed at Facebook, and I remember there was this amazing picture. I want to say it was 12 of you, kind of like in this big. What I'm remember, my mind is conjuring up like a big hangar almost, right?
It was this garage. Yeah, Facebook had these like open garage door things that they had on the old campus.
Yeah, and like I was just like, wow, there's a small team coming to a big building is kind of like my mental image. But did that feel in some ways like going back to, maybe I'm overstretching the analogy, like to -1 again, to kind of like, okay, how do we grow this incredible product that today, incredible product in this larger kind of like, in this larger edifice? Like, what did that feel like?
I think it's simultaneously going like back to -1 in terms of like, how do we operate? Like, how are we going to grow this team? But also having to grow up much quicker. So I think we were stretched on both ends. So on like the -1 front, it was new relationships, like adding new team members. So you're like kind of recontextualizing things as well. And like starting to think longer term on the roadmap than, up to 2012, we were so understaffed that like we weren't doing a lot of product planning. We were looking at where we wanted to be 2 to 3 weeks from now, and then building to that. And it was like very much, sprint to sprint to sprint to sprint. And I was like, okay, we got to start planning and thinking about things more thoroughly. But then on the other side, getting stretched, and like all of a sudden we had a lot more scrutiny because, Facebook had, the legal teams, the privacy teams, and all these like things that like come with the expectations of being larger. So we had to grow up very quickly too in a way that was difficult. All of a sudden, if the FBI has a request of your data and it's Facebook, like you can't play the like, oh, we're a small startup, like give us a few days. Well, like we've never done this before. Like it's like, no, there's a process and we expect you to have this response in this time. And it was having to scale up for that was actually one of the hardest parts. And you're doing it in a way that doesn't reflect itself in the product. That nobody sees that you're having to basically revamp all of your internal processes and internal tooling to like be a bigger company. But you have to do it. So that was definitely a piece of like -1 and then like 1 to 100 happening at the same time.
Yeah, it's almost like how do you grow up to be an adult in like 1 year? Kind of like it's a very hard problem. Your rise and kind of the growth of the product and the two of you as kind of like co-founders is well documented. So I'm going to skip ahead. Okay. I'm going to skip ahead to the part that you decided to move on from kind of like Facebook. Um, Man, Mike, you and Kevin were like rock stars, right? Like you were, celebrities in the technology world. You still are. You were building a product that I think is obviously like fundamentally shaping how people express themselves, how they connect. That must have felt fucking scary, right? So, like,
Yeah.
how did you almost like forget even making the decision, but like how did you almost start like processing some of those I would say both intellectual and emotional almost like signals to give yourself kind of the conviction to do it?
I mean, I think what was hard was this was now 8 years into the Instagram journey. My role, it was always more internal focused than Kevin, who like had both internal and external focus and, did more interviews. But my role had like shifted to have some more external presence, whether it was like being
Right.
part of, if it was like a longer magazine interview. I love Formula One. As you know, we geeked out a lot over Formula One. And, it was just around this. I tell the story because it connects to this notion of how hard it was to separate. But this is like right after Liberty had bought Formula One. I was like, oh, great. Like, this is an opportunity to actually get the drivers on social media because they couldn't use really anything before. So, it's a little bit of a boondoggle. I'm like, I'm going to go. I'm going to connect with, it was like met with Chase Carey. I was like, just going to make this thing so that we can actually get Instagram opened up to the races. And I was like sitting there, a couple months later as we were thinking about leaving. And I was like, man, like, that was such a cool door to open, And it was like, was that the most like business critical thing? Probably not. It was like back that today, it's actually like Instagram and F1 are a really good combination. So there was some
Yeah.
good seed that were planted there. But you start realizing how much of your public persona is associated with this thing that you started and how many friends you've made via that. And a lot of that, like coming to reckoning with that decision was just like, who am I if I'm not the CTO of Instagram? And you can tell yourself, well, I'll always be the co-founder, but it's like, it's a little different when you're not like actively, shaping things and in good and bad ways. So I think a lot of my journey personally was just recognizing that and be like, well, and then you can have the bravado, be like, well, if they didn't, if they don't like me after I leave Instagram, they weren't my friends anyway, or like, but at the same, you're only human, so you still have to think about
Yeah,
this stuff,
exactly.
So
Yeah.
that I would say, and then breaking off from the team was the other big thing. We built this team from 2 people to like the 12 people in the like Facebook garage to at the time we left, we were 1,000. So, it was like, this is the big chunk of people that I know very well. And like all of a sudden we'll get to see every day. So I would say that like maybe the softer, the like, interpersonal, reputational, public persona pieces were probably the hardest part about thinking about leaving.
Yeah, no, that's so well put. Obviously, a lot of people who have just gone through that, I would say, transition or are thinking about it, come talk to me before they join South Park Commons, and I kind of tell them those same three things. I'm like, you will miss your identity because no matter how strongly you feel you can disassociate, in Silicon Valley we are often like an expression of the work that we do, and you will miss that identity. You will not actually miss the work. And it's rare to find someone who like 3 months later is like, oh man, I really missed that exact meeting or that thing I was doing.
Mm-hmm.
It's very rare to hear that, but you will sorely miss the people, right? Like you
Yeah.
make connections, you make dear like emotional connections, and that that gets better with time. But like I still like miss some of the people that I used to work with because those are my fondest memories of like my time at Facebook and Dropbox. In addition to obviously like the effect at scale of the impact. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I wish I had you back then to have, it was like, I definitely felt like I did not have a playbook. It was like, I'm making, this leap and I think I'll be fine, but,
Yeah.
I didn't have kids yet. We had like a dog. We were married, but it was not like you know, it was very different actually leaving Artifacts, which we can talk about in a bit. But at
Yeah.
that point we had 2 kids, so it was like, okay, I have something I can like feel like
Hold on.
is occupying like a lot of my emotional and and
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
time investment, rather than the thing that I was working on.
Okay, so you make this incredibly courageous and difficult decision to kind of leave Instagram and Facebook after 8 years of kind of like honestly like as steep a rocket ship as we see in Silicon Valley. What do you do in like the first 30 days? Like, did you have a plan? Did you know what you're gonna do when you got up, or did you feel like a profound sense of like unmooring? Like, hey, like what am I supposed to do with my time? Or had you planned for that?
I deferred my unmooring, somewhat intentionally, although not entirely intentionally. We had a trip planned to Europe,
Okay.
that we'd been planning for months. So it was actually great. And I had one of those things where just like life, the universe is like showing you something.
Yeah.
One of the visits that we had on this trip, we went to Barcelona, and I had this like pre-scheduled meetup with the chef behind El Bulli,
Okay.
so Ferran Adria, and we visit him, and he had already closed El Bulli. And it's just like, you don't know, it's like this number one best restaurant in the world that he like famously kind of like closed and rebooted. And I feel like almost if you hit number one in the world's best restaurants, like you're like 3 or 4 years from like some crazy reboot, which maybe tells us something about, how to think about this stuff in tech as well.
Yeah.
And he had a neon sign on his like where I went to visit like a warehouse. The warehouse was amazing because it was like both workshop for his next idea and like temple for El Bulli. So he's got like not every menu, but maybe every menu. Like he's cataloged it. Like it's a museum for himself, for his, staff. And then like a workshop for what's next. And then he had the sign that says, cerramos el Bulli para abrir el Bulli. So like we closed el Bulli to open el Bulli, which I think was like such a cool, like thing to read and experience like right when I was just leaving Instagram. It's like I left Instagram to start Instagram and not Instagram again, but whatever is going to happen next. It was like, could not have come at like a better, like, moment of transition for me. And the rest of the trip, I was like reflecting and trying to defer this question, but still be like, okay, I left that to start something new. But it was very much deferring because I got home and I'm so funny to reflect on this. I remember sitting down, the like week I got back and it was like empty document. I love making lists. I'm like a list maker and like a bullet point,
You're a
like
bullet guy, right? Yeah, I know that. Yeah.
So like bullet point. And I was using Workflowy, which like is like bullets as a
Oh, yeah.
service, right? You can just bullets on bullets on bullets. And I was like, all right, I'm going to make my plan now for the next year. And I had this like kind of, not great idea that I think that I never tried to sell, which is basically like, oh, I'm curious about so many things. Like I'm curious about Formula One racing. Like I'd love to like go basically like be an intern on their like software or their aerodynamics team. Like I'm like weirdly passionate about Disney. Like I want to like go, like embed with the Imagineers. And I was like, I'm going to pitch Netflix on a series where like they follow me around and like I'll do like a month at each of those things, I was like realizing it's like, there's a lot of like moving parts here that I'm not necessarily well suited for. But it's really funny because I looked back at that list, maybe a year and a half later. It was like you're gonna laugh. It was like the year of bike. It was like, the year of learning. What am I thinking I'm going to learn? And I had one of them, which was from my college days, interested in neuroscience. And I wanted to be interested in or explore more around like,
The
cheap
BPIs.
at home, brain computer interfaces and,
Yeah.
and, ways of doing really lightweight EEG. And, I got one of these like great 3D printed like things and I spent a week hooking it up, kind of like you did with the,
Yeah.
bookmark thing. I had the whole
Yeah.
thing hooked up and I was measuring alpha and gamma waves and meditating. I was going to build this like meditating VR app, just the ideas. And then like after like a week or two, I was like, I don't feel like doing this anymore. This is not that interesting. It's like not that rewarding. I'm not getting myself getting up. And so it's very funny to me to look back on the list and realize how few of those things I actually ended up doing and realizing that was, fine.
That's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know what?
It was worth making the list. Yeah.
It's worth making the list. Mike, before I react to you making the list, I know you love TV. We share a love of great TV. I will say that you should watch The Bear season 3 if you haven't. It
I have
is
not yet.
it is the perfect articulation of using, in my opinion, creating greatness in a restaurant as a metaphor for starting a company. Like the level of craft, attention to detail, the insanity of like inter-team dynamics. It's actually a work of art. It might be the best TV I've seen in a while. It's beautiful.
Amazing. Can't wait. I watched up to 2, so I got to do the 3.
Yeah, no, it's good.
Well, I did
Sorry,
watch a lot of TV during that time too. And, it was the sort of thing where it's so reductionist, but I had in my head, I'm like, okay, I've done this company and now I need to either ride off into the sunset, never be seen again, start another company, go be an exec at a different company or become an investor. And it felt, that was kind of like, well, that's my option set now. And it's, there's obviously nuance to all of these and definitely more options than I had imagined. But I was sitting there like, well, okay, like maybe I need to like be thinking about the next company. So why don't I like start prototyping and building things that might be the next company. And that was not that satisfying because like then you're not building to scratch a niche or out of intellectual curiosity. You're building to build or building with this like very specific destination in mind.
It's so funny you use those examples because Ruchi, when she talks about the founding of South Park Commons, that is quite literally the same words that she uses. She's like, listen, I had a good run in Silicon Valley, so I could have started a company, been an exec at a company, started my venture fund, joined a venture fund. But what I really wanted to do was, what is the stuff that I don't know could be interesting? What do I need to go
Yeah.
tinker with and learn? And that was actually literally the original inspiration for South Park Commons.
Yeah. No, I love where
So
you guys ended
yeah.
up. I remember I was working with a coach at the time and she had me read a book called, gosh, I'll get the name of this book, but it's basically a book about transitions and it's like written from the perspective of people of like transition careers, transition cities, like made big changes in their lives. And the author talks about having that like, that moment, that like messy, I don't know what I'm doing and I just need to sit in the mess for a little bit and something is
Yeah.
going to
Yeah.
emerge from it. And as I was sitting in that, I was working with her and we were doing like a lot of like, what gives me energy, the kind of classic coaching stuff. And it was like, I like a lot of ideas. I don't like just doing one. Clearly, I can't decide as a theme of this podcast and of my life. I love building. I love being around builders. And she's like, you need to figure out some way of like starting a lab or some kind of like incubation space and all of that. And it ended up not working out that way. But I think I see a lot of parallels with the things that led you guys to
Yeah.
start SBC.
It's amazing. Um, okay, I'm gonna give a timeout here, so I'll let. So, Mike, I'm gonna go on for. I might speed it up because I think we'll have enough footage in about 15 minutes. Okay, so I'm gonna go through Artifact and then get you some hot takes on Anthropic and AI. Okay,
Sounds
I
good.
don't want to
Yeah.
take up too much of your time either. Okay. Um, Okay, so you make a bunch of lists, you do some learning, you do the EEG stuff. At which point do you decide to kind of like get the gang back together and actually maybe like start actively converging on something like Artifact?
Yeah. Well, for us, it was like I would say three chapters. Chapter one was we had this hypothesis that was like, well, one of the four options is you invest, but we didn't want to go join a venture fund. Still wanted to preserve some optionality. So like, let's do angel investing, but take it seriously. So we had our, deal flow. We reached out to all the investors that we liked and said, hey, if we could add value to a deal, let us know. It's, for founders that have done well and will hopefully add value. It's like fairly easy to get a small allocation in rounds. It's much harder to lead around, but we weren't trying to lead around. So it was okay. We did that pretty seriously for about a year. And I look back and I'm like proud of the investments we made, but I missed building. Like I knew I missed building. So I was like starting to percolate, like I still want to build. What's that going to look like? Maybe we start a company. And then COVID, like COVID was like instantly, so challenging and awful and, completely disruptive. But I would say like the silver lining of COVID for us was, it was like, okay, nobody's expecting us to start a company right now. Like the world is just crazy. Like we can do things that are hopefully helpful without needing to be a company. So we worked on RT Live, which was using machine learning to predict the spread of COVID per state, and we eventually did per country. And at the time, that project was, need out in the world that we were identifying. Both of us had interest in machine learning. Kevin went really deep on machine learning for that project. For me, it was a way of reconnecting with front-end engineering, which I hadn't done for a while. And like, again, we weren't doing it thinking like our next company is going to have front-end engineering and machine learning. It was like, no, this is like a thing that we want to do right now. But you can draw a direct line from that to Artifact. So, chapter one, angel investing, not entirely satisfying to us. Chapter two was doing these like very COVID specific projects. And, we did RT Live together. Caitlin, my wife, and I built we spent our, COVID in West Marin, and there's like incredible whale migration patterns, but we'd always miss the whales. So we built this like whale, community notifier, and it was like plugging in the Twilio API, doing mobile stuff, like doing it. It was like this fun, like project that, again, it's not going to be a company, but I can draw lines from that to stuff that we did later as well. And then chapter three was, you're kind of still in COVID, but the wave has gone down. You can start thinking about what the next thing is. And, we were still very interested in machine learning. We'd been thinking about news and in general, like how do people get their information? And we really wanted to move beyond like the follow graph, which was, such a core part of Instagram. And those things all converged together. And we started having this conversation, like, why don't we start this thing and like, start building? And, we spent the first 3-4 months, like there was no LLC, S Corp, C Corp. It was just the two of us hacking on things and collaborating. And you can have that trust when you've built something with somebody that like, we'll figure out those details in a little bit. We don't need, like, I love like first time founders are like, we incorporated. I'm like, what do you have? And they're like, I don't know. We got like our incorporation. I'm like, great. You're committed to paying $700 a year to some like state agency now. Like, good job. But we know in prototyping, we're like, this is fun. It's really fun to build. We're in a fun space. Like, it's really fun to explore what machine learning is doing. Like, the product we're building, like, has like, significant other market fit, which is all you can ask for at the very beginning. And, it led us to have enough conviction. Like, I think primarily that we wanted to build together again. That was like the highest, high order bit. And the second one was this space of personalization and machine learning was really interesting. And like, it was only 2000 and, what was that? 2020, early 21. And at the same time, AI was not yet what it is today. And so like we were talking about machine learning versus AI. And that was the technology of the time. And then I would say that like the leap from that to like, let's form a company and go hire people, I think came from a concern that I think both of us had around, well, we've done the company. We want to do a company. We have to from a like, I'll be uneasy if I'm not working on something great, but how do we actually make it feel real? And that's where the leap came from. Like, let's bring other people on and actually hire people in.
So, dude, you have had such incredible success building your first company. You like, was there fear like about like how people were going to perceive it? Like, all of us have our little or big ego. And it's not easy to kind of like have a second act in public. And like, is that something you thought about? Is that you discussed with Kevin, or you're like, you know what? I already had it. Like I've had the one hit. It doesn't matter. Like, did it free you? Was it still a little constraining? Could you tell us about that?
I think I'll tell you like psychologically, but also talking very practically how it was a real challenge. So psychologically, you're like, well, can I build something as big as Instagram? Like probabilistically, no. Like that thing is like, well, top 3-4 apps ever. Yeah. Like, right. The odds that you will replicate that are quite low.
No matter how good you are, No matter how good you are.
And, even if you get lucky a second time, are you going to get lucky in the same way? Like, I don't, it was unprecedented. And it really blocked me for a while. And then I eventually realized, like, I just, this is going to sound funny. I don't think I've ever actually said it out loud, and especially not on a podcast, but like, hitting 1 million users was very cool. Hitting 10 was really cool. 100 was interesting. Between 100 and 1 billion, like, it sounds awful, but it was like, cool, another milestone, but like, it doesn't, like, it becomes so abstracted at some point. And so when I was thinking about that, it helped me think about Artifact. I was like, well, it might not hit I think 1 billion users is an absurd number of people using anything, including your product, right? Yeah. Like, it might not hit that, but like, that wasn't why I was still working on it. I was still working on it because like, I loved building with the people that I was with. Like, I liked the day to day. I liked the building. And like, every time I like drifted and I was like, oh, but what if this doesn't work? I was like, back to this, like, go, like, what is the day to day like? And what do you actually want to be doing? And just regrounding myself in that as much as I could. So that's how I worked through it emotionally. But I would say that like, it also had an effect on how we thought about launch, which was like, here's the bar for launch, right? Like, it's not Instagram V1 where, we didn't have collapsible comments. So if it was a long comment thread, you just gotta just scroll. We didn't summarize our likes. So like, likes would just flow off the page, like all this stuff that it's like, obviously if it hadn't worked, we wouldn't have worried about it. Because it worked, it looked absurd. For the longest time, we didn't have commas in our numbers in the stats part of your profile. So like, once people hit 1,000 followers, it was like, I don't know, it's just going to look super messy. And like the bar we held ourselves to, on product, on social features, and especially on the machine learning, like all of that, we really held to a really high bar. And I think it led us to launch much later than we should have. So, we built for about 1.5 years before launching. And the last like 6 months, we were building things at high quality, I think, but not getting that same contact with the real world that we were talking about. And we got more data into the system in the first 12 hours of being out in the world. And I was still with a waiting list than we had for the previous like 6 months, right? So it was like, and what does an ML system thrive on? It's data, And I think the effect that had was like when we got to the start line, we talk about -1, like we went -1 to 0, but we actually like, it was a much more tiring journey than it would have been otherwise. So we didn't start, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed at 0, like, yes, launch time, let's do it. I was like, whew, that was a lot. Like, we definitely, startups sometimes take much longer to start, especially in like the hardware space. But we didn't start with the same freshness as I think we did with Instagram. And I think that made it harder to iterate from that point forward.
Interesting. That's a good observation. I'll come back to one thing that you said that really resonated with me, and it's something I often think about in my own life, which is that at some point, even if you've built a bunch of things that have done well and you're proud of them, I often am just like, but I still need something to do every day for the rest of my life that I like doing, right? Like
Yeah.
that is almost the point. And for me, a lot of it boils down to like, I like building things with smart people. I also enjoy it when they're successful, but that's like that's afterwards. Like on a day to
Yeah.
day basis, I like having something to do with smart people that like, like the act of building. And once, I'm able to reduce it down to that artifact, then I'm just like, you know what? I can be a happy camper because like I know I
Yeah.
can do that if I want to every single day.
Yeah. 100%. Yeah. And that's what I was choosing. It was like that, like getting to do that day to day, and like, did we need
Yeah.
to do another company? Like not from a like, career perspective, but from a like, I am very happy to be, engaged on product. I got to write so much code, through the artifact journey. I mean, did a bunch of the iOS stuff, did a lot of the back end, did some machine learning infra. Like it was so cool, and like fun to be able to do that after like being at Instagram where like, I was managing a really big team and like just being back in there was great.
That's awesome. Um, so you guys do Artifact and the app does well, but it's news. News is a hard kind of like sector. Um, I also thought you kind of did like a pretty I know I'm fast forwarding probably a bunch, but it's kind of like rare. Like, and I think not enough consumer founders do this because they tend to kind of like be okay, kind of like being zombies for a while. You kind of take the pretty bold step of like, actually, this is not having the kind of impact that we want to see. And we're not going to just kind of like mosey along for a while and kind of like, yeah, it's just like, hey, we took a good shot. Cool. It didn't work. Like, we can all move on. That takes guts. Like, tell me a little bit about how you came up with that decisiveness to do that.
Yeah. I think it was twofold. One was, and it's funny because people are like, well, you just shut it down because it didn't reach Instagram scale. And it wasn't that it was like not like on the trajectory for a billion users. Like
Yeah.
again, nothing is really,
Right. Right.
but it was more that like you can feel it when something is growing. Like I think I have this half baked notion that I need to formalize at some point, which is like, is there energy in the system or is there not energy in the system? Like with
Absolutely.
Artifact, like we poured blood, sweat, and tears into into the product design. Kevin did so much deep work on like machine learning and personalization system. I think our recommendations were phenomenal, especially if you had enough data in the system. But like the energy was not in the system. Like we'd launch new things and it was like, people would react well. And there was a core group of people I still hear today, like random people reach out to me. They're like, I miss Artifacts so much. And I'll meet random people, like even in the course of my Anthropic work, they'll be like, oh, I'm happy to take this meeting about Anthropic, but Artifact, man. So like it had its core group of people that loved it. But it wasn't on a trajectory where it was going to grow. And I think what we did well in terms of decision making was it's not like we woke up one day and we're like, this is it. We were like, all right, we have a hypothesis of like three more things that we think could, move the needle here. Let's try them. Let's give them a little time. Let's reevaluate. Yeah, they like, they set a new baseline for growth, but they didn't inflect it. And it was like, at that point, like, to your point, like, is it the thing we want to spend another year on? And the answer was no. Like there's real opportunity cost. And it's funny because you can think of opportunity cost in this like abstract way. Like there's all these things I could be doing. In reality, I look now and I'm like, man, I ended up having this like crazy opportunity to join Anthropic and be CPO. And like that window is a window. And it's not to say that's the only window that'll ever open. I don't want to create like FOMO on people, but like it's so cool that I got to like go through that window and that was done because we were able to be deliberate about Artifact.
No, I was just kind of thinking, I've been in Silicon Valley for 20 plus years now. I can't actually think of too many people who have shut down kind of a consumer app of their own accord at the stage that you guys did. And I think I wish, I know this sounds odd to say, I wish more people did that because it would allow them to go and do the next thing, right? Because again, kind of the philosophy at SPC is like the earlier you can shut down something that doesn't have energy, the better it is for
Yeah.
all involved, right? Like
Yeah.
the worst state for a startup is when it's kind of like growing slowly. Like that is
Yeah.
actually the worst spot. Like it's way better for a startup to be dead or to be growing fast. Like obviously growing fast is the best case, but growing slowly, that's not why we build startups, right? That's a hard state to be in. So a lot of props to you guys for that. That's hard.
The
And I
really
just hope
tricky
people
thing, I
get
mean,
that.
we were fortunate to be self-funded because, it meant that that decision was one that was just
Sure.
between me and Kevin, and we were able to make that decision. It is much harder, once you've raised, and it's especially hard if you've raised a lot. So, I'm seeing a lot of people that raise just monster rounds in like 21, even in like beginning of 22, and you're like, you have a lot of money. And like, I'm starting to see the like, well, like, how about we buy back all the share? Like, there's some reconfiguration that's happening. And in some
Yeah,
cases,
yeah.
the companies are still really good. They just need a refactor. But in other cases, you're like, man, like, is this ever going to be the company that you thought it was going to be? And it's like, is this good for the world and for you to keep working at it? Like, maybe not.
Probably gonna get into trouble with my VC colleagues for saying this, but I think they should actually be more supportive of letting these companies do something else, or actually just like returning some capital back because that's okay. I think that's actually healthy for the ecosystem. It's like creative destruction, right?
Yeah.
But maybe to kind of let's talk a little bit about Anthropic, right? Because by the way, I love Sonnet 3.5. I think it's my favorite model nowadays. Okay, I you kind of use it for everything. But what I find really interesting is that a company like Anthropic is both the result of like many years of seminal work in terms of like both kind of like the math and the statistics and the actual machine learning theory, but also of distributed systems, right? Like how do you
Yeah.
get lots of machines to act in concert to build like a really crazy model that you express and then serve through all of the hardware? So in some ways that's pretty complex, but then on the product side it still feels like minus one right now in my opinion. It's
Yes.
early days, right? Like
Totally.
how do we actually use this thing? So what's been like what is both like what's it been? I think it's been what like 4 weeks, 6 weeks.
8 weeks. It feels like 3 months. It's been 8 weeks.
Yeah, so what's been the experience like, and maybe tell us a little bit about what are you thinking in terms of what can you tell us about what you're hoping to inject into the product over the course until the end of the year, let's say.
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, on topic was just like super interesting, like confluence of so many things that I wouldn't have been able to anticipate because, I had talked myself into believing that the only way to have sort of a greenfield product opportunities to start a company, which is kind of depressing because starting a company, as I've got to experience, is really hard. And like, I
It's
didn't
very
really want to
hard.
start another company. And I
Yeah.
was like, am I going to go and like be a like product person at somewhere that already has a really mature product? But on the other hand, I had missed from the Instagram days, like showing up and having like 8 things going on. Again, the theme of our conversation, like I like doing a lot of things at once. And so like, I liked that Instagram that we had multiple product teams and multiple engineering teams doing a bunch of stuff. And I was like, all right, I want a fairly like, mid-stage or like growing company that I can join that needs me but has a lot of greenfield product. It was like actually narrow it down to like not very many companies in the world, but have that. And it ended up working out so perfectly in that I came in and they're like, the beginnings of a like product and product initiatives, and they'd hired product people, but like I could come in and help like drive things forward and bring like all the things that I've learned, from the consumer side, from like the ML product side on Artifact, but also apply it to this company that has both, this API business that's unlocking, all sorts of things, people to build interesting things, as well as, all what everybody wants to do on like Cloud AI and Cloud AI Pro. So it was like just unlikely. And I was like extremely happy that that kind of thing came together at once. But it goes to show like, if you're having that FOMO, if you're thinking about restarting things, like hey, if you put yourself out there and you're having the conversations, like those doors, can appear
100%.
and then you can just be ready to go through them. Shows how I'm thinking about things like 8 weeks in. So some hot takes, but building in there.
Yeah.
People love artifacts. I promise there was no like, oh, my thing was Artifact. Let's call this thing Artifacts. Like total coincidence. If you haven't played with Artifacts, it's this like, co-creation tool between like, it works really well with 3.5 Sonnet, where you can like create documents, create mini games and websites. That points to me to something very, very cool, which is like, for all the talk and promise of like low code and, no code, like it was still this abstraction of like, either you're working on top of some kind of like workflow builder or like drag and drop thing, or you're like doing code, but in this like almost like pseudo codey way. And the thing that like unlocked for me when I saw Artifacts is like, this is truly no code. Like you could, like I've built several things in Artifacts where I didn't even look at the code it generated. Like I don't actually know if it used React or Svelte, or neither, or if it just like pulled it, like, I don't know. And, if you're building large software, of course it matters. But if you're building these like prototypes or demos or just like, web apps to help you build an intuition about something, like how it's built doesn't matter, I think, at all. And so there's something super interesting about these like mini apps that people are creating and sharing, and like exploring that more fully in two ways, I think is really interesting. One is, how do they start getting access to more data or more like knowledge that they can go deeper on? So whether it's like things that you're thinking about, documents you've written or have been written, or eventually data stores as well, like connecting that to, your Google Docs would be really interesting, right? Like, what are the ways you could actually start reading and writing from more than just like this ephemeral kind of space? I think that's really cool. And then second is like, what's the publishing story? Like right now you can share them and like you click a link and like you're in a fully functioning web app that somebody like built by just prompting the AI. But like, could you imagine them being, something that has a little bit more permanence, like maybe inside a company? Like, hey, I, prompted Claude to pull a list of our top 10 customers every day, and I didn't have to go bug our BI person. I didn't have to like go understand, whatever particular dashboarding tool we were using this month. Like, I just did it. And if that's the case, then like, how do I interact with that internally, and how do people remix it? So that area, I find it's leading to a lot of really cool creativity outside. And then that's the case. I learned this with Instagram. It breeds a lot of creativity inside too, because you're seeing all these use cases that
Absolutely.
are now possible that weren't possible, 3 weeks ago.
It's really interesting. I mean, just to stay on that for a second, I think one of the big weird turns we took in low code, no code was to make it look more like software engineering. Whereas in reality, low code, no code is more like messy Excel stuff, right? It's just like you use it, you throw it away. It should be messy, it should be dirty, and you don't really care that much. And I think that you're totally correct that as we use these, whether it's Artifact or some kind of similar system, you can express yourself quickly without caring what actually happens underneath, and you're comfortable throwing it away because you can build it again easily, right? And I think that makes a huge difference.
Totally. And, there's no technical debt. It's getting recreated. And there's limitations to that, of course. Like, I'm not saying that you're going to build a software suite on that, at least not right now. But there's like, it points the way to something really, really interesting there, too.
Amazing. Well, Mike, this has been an incredible conversation. You're obviously a dear friend who I've known for a while, but as you kind of have taken me through kind of your journey, I'm just kind of struck by how many times you have operated from a place of both conviction, but also vulnerability and courage. And thank you kind of for being so upfront with kind of what your journey has been. I hope that, listening to some of the decisions you have made and how you've approached them will inspire people out there as they do their own -1 journey. So thank you so much.
Thank you. This has been a lot of fun. Like, good podcast one. I feel like we could talk for another 2 hours and have lots to talk about as well. But I was trying to channel the things I wish I had heard when I was making these decisions. And at the time, there was nothing really out there to help me guide through it.
Really appreciate your time.
Awesome.
Awesome.